Hey, if you're a fan of Van Halen, I think you're going to enjoy what I have for you here today. And we're going to do something just a little bit different. I'm going to put a little twist on something. Now, a lot of times on this channel, what we do is we'll go through old Circus Magazine, Hit Parader magazines, and we'll just go flip through them. But I'm going to do something else kind of different with this time. I'm also going to put it in context and share other things that were happening at that point. And this is going to... When I went through this process of putting this together, I mean, oh my gosh, just the memories were just flying. This is an article called A Van Halen History. It starts off with, in the beginning, David Lee Roth, born October 10th, 1955 in Bloomington, Indiana, grew up in Pasadena, California, attended Muir High School, attended classes rarely, an average student, according to the school's Dean of Men. Eddie Van Halen, born January 26, 1957, and Alex Van Halen, born May 8th, 1955, in Ningeman, Amsterdam. I'm sure I pronounced that wrong. Sons of a musician father, they began studying classical piano when Alex was 6 and Eddie was 7. Alex played guitar and Eddie bought a drum kit with money earned from a paper route. But while I was out throwing papers, Alex was practicing my drums. They switched instruments. Eddie's first guitar was a Tesco Del Rey from Sears Roebuck. In 1968, the family left Holland for California. Quote, "We had some family that had moved to LA," recollects Alex, "and they always wrote us letters about the beautiful weather and the ample opportunities. So taking a gamble, our parents sold everything they had and moved." Eddie and Alex attended Pasadena High School not far from Muir. Now, when I listened to Alex Van Halen's book, Brothers, something that just, I don't know why it just never occurred to me, but when they came to the United States, they didn't speak English. And why that didn't occur to me is that when I was a kid and everybody would talk about, yeah, Eddie and Alex, they're from, I think we used to say Holland. But whenever we'd say that, we'd kind of, I would assume just in my mind that they probably came here when they were babies and then they just grew up. But that was wrong. They actually, when they arrived here, kind of like Gene Simmons, they didn't speak English at all. They were actually young. They were old enough that they were interacting with people. They were understanding the world around them. They could, and it was just an interesting thing for me to put that in perspective, listening to Alex Van Halen in his book going, oh my gosh, this is one of the reasons those two became so close. They come to America and then, those two and then their family speak this other language, and then they kind of had each other at that time. And you can see why they were so close over the years, just from that alone. Anyway, just kind of an interesting thing. Like I said, it just didn't, when I was a younger kid and then throughout my life, just didn't even think about it. And then I heard the book and I thought, oh, that's kind of something I just hadn't really thought about. Okay, so now, the period from 1974 to 1976, the Van Halens and Roth meet, and with fourth musician on bass form Mammoth. Now, let's talk about this period of time. I mean, okay, so many things were going on in the world. So between 1974 and 1976, this period that we're talking about, where Van Halen's just getting started, where they're just organizing Mammoth. Rush, they come on the scene. Kiss comes on the scene. During the same period, Led Zeppelin's Physical Graffiti comes out. So, they've already been influenced by all of that early Led Zeppelin stuff at this point. So Physical Graffiti's coming out. 1976, Presence, Led Zeppelin comes out. Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run is coming out in this period. Queen's A Night at the Opera is coming out during this time. Boston's first album. I mean, think about that. What an impact that album had on the world. And that album's coming out while they're forming the early stages of Van Halen. Kiss's Destroyer album, which was kind of and Alive right before that, which were pivotal things for them. Hotel California by the Eagles. Frampton Comes Alive was from this period. Now, Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein were coming out during this period. The Godfather Part 2. Jaws. Do you remember when Jaws came out? That was coming out while Van Halen was forming. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which I didn't see until much later in my life, which was kind of amazing. Rocky Horror Picture Show came out during this period when they were forming. And I don't know if you ever seen, if you ever been to when you were a teenager, because a lot of you that are watching this are my age, do you remember going to a midnight movie and seeing Rocky Horror Picture Show? It was a crazy time. Holy Grail came out during this time. Taxi Driver, Rocky came out during this time. And then also during this period, the fall of Saigon, 1975. And in 1974, the year before that, is when Nixon resigned. And also in 1976, the same period, Apple Computer is formed. Isn't it? It's just fascinating thinking, as they're putting Van Halen together, all of these monumental things taking place in pop culture and just in the world in general. Okay. The Van Halens and Roth form Mammoth. They play supermarket openings, wet t-shirt contests, and other modest jobs. Soon, the bassist is ejected in favor of Michael Anthony, who was born June 20th, 1955. Mammoth amass a repertoire that Anthony estimates at about 300 songs, encompassing everything from the white hard rock of Cream, Led Zeppelin, and Aerosmith, to the black funk of the Ohio Players and James Brown. Now, I know we have a lot of musicians that watch this channel. 300 songs. I think I've played in cover bands before. I don't think we ever got much past maybe 100, 125, maybe 300 tunes. That's pretty. I'm guessing there's a lot of people watching this right now. I go, yeah, I could probably in my sleep do 300 anyway. But that is when you're in a cover band. It's what you do. You just know everything, so you can please whoever happens to be there when you're playing. Okay. Let's see here. Oh, whenever possible, they sneak in one of their Eddie Van Halen, David Lee Roth penned originals. Quote, but 1% was about all. What 1% was about all we could get away with. Unquote, says Anthony. And also, all of you musicians know that too, where you have all your original stuff. You're like, man, I want to play this, and then you're kind of like sneak a few of them in there in the middle of your set, and no one's the wiser. Okay, some of the clubs they play are little more than seedy beer joints. One night, Eddie recalls at a biker's bar called Walter Mitty's, quote, these two bikers started arguing about whose motorcycle was quicker. One guy whipped out a hunting knife and stabbed the other, turning the page, stabbed the other one right in front of us. The biker's guts were hanging out and he died the next day, but we kept on playing. How many of you that are in bands had an experience like that? We actually showed up to play a gig to set up right after something similar had happened at one place that we played. But we didn't see it. We got there like 20 minutes after the police left. But it's some of these places you play when you're in a cover band. You know what I'm talking about. Okay. Mammoth build a following around Southern California, and at one point play 5 45-minute sets, no breaks, 24 nights in a row. They play Gazzarri's on Hollywood Sunset Strip, opening for acts as varied as Santana, UFO, Nils Lofgren, and Sparks. By 1976, they were able to draw 3,000 to the Pasadena Civic Auditorium, and the band members sense that they are on the verge of breaking. Quote, they'd sit in their vans, remembers Rodney Bingenheimer, who booked them into the Taste-Making Starwood Club. And they'd always say, maybe someday we'll get to play the big halls, unquote. That's actually, I mean, that's pretty impressive. A local band being able to pull that kind of crowd in. Okay, so now we're in 1977. Now, let's think about all the things that were going on in the world in 1977. And this is when Van Halen is discovered. So, and this is the other stuff that's happening in the world. And we'll just start off. It says, it's the Starwood that the group is discovered by Kiss bassist Gene Simmons in attendance with girlfriend Babe Dwell. Okay, here we go. 1977. Fleetwood Mac Rumors, Kiss Love Gun and Kiss Alive 2, Rush A Farewell to Kings, Queen's News of the World. I mean, this is when they're getting discovered, this is when We Will Rock You is introduced to the world. And then this is the other thing that's so important to remember. The Sex Pistols' Nevermind the Bollocks comes out in 1977. And this just changed so much about just the music industry in general, the impact that they had. And they weren't around for very long. It was a very, very like flash in the pan thing, but what an impact they made. Iggy Pop, Lust for Life, Pink Floyd's Animals, Cheap Trick's In Color, and then meet one of the biggest selling albums of all Time, produced by Todd Rundgren, by the way, comes out here at the time they're getting discovered, and it was Bat Out of Hell by Meatloaf and Jim Steinman. Anyway, there. And then also 1977, as they're getting discovered, Star Wars comes out. Close Encounters of the Third Kind comes out. And maybe more important from a music standpoint, Saturday Night Fever, 1977. This is the time that Van Halen's being discovered. And Smokey and the Bandit, remember that one? And then what else happened? Big deal in 1977 in the world of music. Elvis Presley dies. And maybe less noteworthy as far as most people go, but pretty important, Mark Bolan from T-Rex also died that year. But anyway, 1977, that's when Van Halen's getting discovered. Those are the things. How many of those things do you remember when those things happened, when those albums came out, such a big deal. Okay, 1977. Kiss bassist Gene Simmons in attendance with girlfriend. Everybody in the group really impressed me, he says. This is Gene Simmons, of course. Here we were in 1977 at the start of New Wave, and here was a long-haired bunch of guys on stage who were totally confident in being themselves, and the audience loved the pants off of them. Simmons finances and produces a demo tape for the band, but can't procure label interest, even though the 13 songs recorded later make up much of the first and second Van Halen albums. Quote, so I told him, here's the tape, good luck. And it's interesting because, Gene Simmons talks about that often, where he's the one that discovered Van Halen. I mean, they were already, really making a splash in the area that they were in, so a lot of people knew about them. But he really did fund this whole thing, and he actually tried to get Bill Aucoin to start managing them, or he basically all of Kiss's infrastructure. He's like, do you not understand? These guys are going to be huge, and they're like, meh, and they just passed on it. And so Gene goes, I can't help you, I guess. And so he said, here's the tapes, and then that was it. So, but anyway, that was Van Halen's first experiences in the studio, and going through that whole production process was there with Gene Simmons of Kiss. So anyway, fascinating stuff. After first weighing the possible ego conflicts that might result, Mammoth changed their name to Van Halen. Other names considered include the horrific Rat Salad and Daddy Longlegs, the latter the inspiration of Gene Simmons. I don't know that Gene was always great at that piece of it. Let's see, who says in retrospect, at the time, I thought it was the brilliant name of the century, but its meaning is lost in the dim recesses of time, unquote. In fall of 77, Van Halen are spotted at the Starwood by producer Ted Templeman and are virtually signed on the spot to Warner Brothers Records. Templeman will produce all the band's LPs through 1983. And that's only sort of true, the way they describe it there. Ted didn't just happen to be at a place and see him playing. It was planned. He'd been invited there, hey, you got to come see this band. I mean, it was, it wasn't that Ted Templeman spotted them. It didn't quite go like that. But anyway, it was important because Templeman, when he was there and he saw them, he could see what was happening here. And then, of course, he produced that first album. And there's so many interesting stories about the way that whole thing went down. And he actually takes at least a little bit of credit for Eruption existing on that record. Because when you hear Ted Templeman talk about it, he literally says that he was just kind of walking through the studio at one point during the process when they were recording that first album. And Eddie Van Halen was just kind of noodling around with this little almost warm-up thing that he had. And Ted Templeman goes, what is this that you're doing here? And he just, it's a little thing. And then the next thing you know, he's like, roll tape. And as I recall, he was already rolling tape in the other room when they were, because Eddie Van Halen was out there just playing this stuff, and so they knew that they had something there, and that the fact that ended up on that album and had such an impact on so many people over the years, just that thing Eruption. So many, it's just kind of one of those touchstone things. If you're a guitar player, you need to learn how to play this. Okay, so now 1978. Let's talk about what was happening in 1978. Kiss's solo albums. Do you remember those? it kind of became this, what are you doing? As a matter of fact, when you read Paul Stanley's book, he talks about Eddie Van Halen calling him at one point and saying, why did you guys do that? What was going on with your band? And it was years later that Eddie called him about this, but it was one of those things where Eddie was kind of watching his band and trying to figure out how to keep the thing together. And he's talking to Paul like, well, what was that all about? And it is one of those things in the history of music where you go, yeah, what was that all about? And there's a lot of different stories. And I know what I've read in different things, but there's all these different people. Whenever I bring it up, there's like, no, that's not really why. And you go, okay, well, there's just so many different reasons why people have explained over the years. And everybody's got their own little memories. And of course, the truth is probably somewhere sandwiched in all of it. But in 1978, solo albums, Judas Priest... this is around the time that Hell Bent for Leather came out. Now it gets a little confusing because it was Killing Machine, then it was Hell Bent for Leather. But anyway, this is that period. Long Live Rock and Roll. Rainbow. Blue Oyster Cult, Some Enchanted Evening, which I've got in the other room. That was a pretty cool album. And it was kind of a significant thing there in the history of Blue Oyster Cult. And also, Kiss Meets the Phantom of the Park comes out this year when this happens. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, not the Beatles version, but the one that had the Bee Gees and Peter Frampton and Aerosmith, and there were so many other people that just recorded a bunch of Beatles tunes, and they made a movie called Sgt. Pepper's, and an album, I've got it too, called Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which they just recreated a lot of old Beatles stuff and made a little movie out of it. Anyway, that's what that happened in 1978. Peter Frampton was huge at the time. Okay. Invasion of the Body Snatchers. You remember that movie? Van Halen, that was coming out at the time Van Halen's first album was coming out. And you know what else was? Grease. And, of course, Superman, the movie. Remember that one? I think all of us remember. Man, I remember that movie. And Grease. Those are so popular. So, now here we go. Van Halen, 1978, here we are. The first album is released February 10th and sells 1.5 million copies, despite the fact that heavy metal is in a dormant period, overshadowed by burgeoning new wave and the height of discomania. Like I said, it's interesting to put these things in context, because here we are in 1978, and just the year before, Saturday Night Fever comes out. Disco was everywhere. It was so big. And it just, when you look at what was going on at the same time, it's so interesting. Okay. However, Van Halen's sound transcends traditional metal. Big rock is their description of their music, and it's apropos. Van Halen do have the thundering bottom of most heavy outfits, but their best material, such as the strongly melodic Runnin' with the Devil and Jamie's Cryin', is topped with Anthony's popish high harmonies. And that was part of that signature Van Halen sound. And it's so easy for people to overlook the significance of Michael Anthony. Of course, you read Ted Templeman and he talks about the fact that every time they produced him, Michael was just always in the pocket. He knew exactly what to play. Everything was perfect all the time. But noting his bass guitar playing is one thing. That vocal part, that voice, that thing that he had over the top of everything that kind of gave it a hard rock Beach Boys flavor. I don't know how else you would describe it, but it was just because it added this kind of fun energy to the music with Michael Anthony's and his unique voice just sitting up there right over the top of it. He was so amazing. That voice, like it says there, popish high harmonies. That was it. He was such an important part of that band. Hang on just a second, this will be really quick. With hundreds of videos on our channel now, we've made playlists to make it easy for you to find whatever the thing is that you're interested in. We have a playlist with all of our Rush videos, Kiss, Led Zeppelin, Van Halen. We have categories like 80s metal and even our popular magazine flip-throughs, where we go through page by page with Circus Magazine, Hit Parader, and others, all in 4K resolution. You'll find it all organized and ready to explore. Just click the playlist tab on our channel's homepage. All right, back to the video. The sound. Okay, in addition, they boast two distinctive soloists. One is Eddie Van Halen, whose guitaring is an amalgam of styles of Hendrix, Clapton, Beck, and Page, peppered with his own techniques, such as his frequent use of harmonics. It's so funny when you start listing, well, he's an amalgamation of, I guess. I mean, you could probably throw a half a dozen other people in there too and just go, but he still was just his own thing. Eddie Van Halen was just Eddie Van Halen. So it's just funny when people put stuff like that in there. Of course, he was influenced by people. It's just that you go, his style, I don't know. He was just him. And so easy to distinguish that when you hear "Beat It" by Michael Jackson, you just instantly know that's Eddie Van Halen playing that solo, or somebody that really, really impersonates him like incredibly well. You just know it. Not just the playing, but the way it's organized, the sounds, it's just so obviously him. So when you start, amalgam of styles, ultimately he really was his own style in so many ways. Okay. Let's see, peppered with his own techniques, such as his frequent use of harmonics, distortion, and two hands on the neck playing. The other soloist is Roth. His notoriety as rock's Randy Dandy often obscures the fact that he's an outstanding vocalist, because, of course, he's compared to Black Oak, Arkansas. Okay, often ad-libbing yelps and howls like a guitarist interjecting licks. And he did just have those noises, yelps that he'd throw in that were just so cool. And there's so few people that can make whatever those noises were that he was making, because it was just cool and interesting and unique. Let's see here. In February, the group embarks on its first major tour, opening for Ronnie Montrose and Journey. Having steadily played in bars for 3 years, Roth jokingly calls it the Van Halen World Vacation. With his onstage acrobatics, Roth establishes himself as one of rock's most flamboyant showmen. He also establishes himself as one of rock's most quotable personalities. Early Rothisms include, "We're an antidote to boredom," the prophetic declaration that Eddie Van Halen is the first guitar hero of the 80s. All the other guitar heroes are dead. And the perceptive admission that he has, quote, "the world's biggest mouth." The entire band thrives on showmanship, once parachuting into a stadium show in Anaheim, California, before 62,000 screaming fans. And again, that's only partly true. This was an idea that was apparently David Lee Roth said, "Hey, what we need to do is we need to parachute into this show." Of course, we're not going to be one parachuting. And what happened was they literally had a plane come over, and you had 4 guys that even had the wigs on, so they had the long hair, jump out of this airplane and parachute down. And at the last minute, they land behind the stadium. And guess who happens to be right there near where they're landing, hidden in a van? Who then, as the people who actually parachuted kind of hid themselves, then the 4 guys in Van Halen come running out of the van and up onto the stage. The heroes who just jumped out of the plane wearing the jumpsuits and everything, when in reality it was other guys that jumped. But everybody there, did Van Halen just jump out of a plane? And they upstaged everybody because of doing that. So when they say here the band once jumped out of a plane in front of 62,000 fans, it's not really true. 4 jumpers jumped out of a plane, and then they pretended to be them when they ran up onto the stage. Of course, that's what happened. But I mean, it just correcting sort of what they're saying in here, putting it in context. Late in the year, booked on a tour with Black Sabbath, Van Halen consistently steal the show. Sabbath upstaged by Van Halen, reads the headline after performance in Atlanta. And I think, as I recall, Ozzy even admitted that at one point, like, we didn't have a chance against these guys. And of course, in 1978, Black Sabbath was not at their peak at that moment, to say the least. Okay, 1979. The group sets its sight on recording on record number 2. Instead of the last album, which sounded like 4 people sounding like 6, proclaims Roth, this one will be 4 people sounding like 12. Okay, so now we're in 1979. What was going on in 1979? This is so interesting. 1979, AC/DC puts out Highway to Hell, which basically creates one of the most significant rock anthems in the history of everything ever. I mean, it just is like the rock anthem. Scorpions put out Love Drive. And me, I'm looking at that like this is when they did kind of the trifecta between Love Drive, Animal Magnetism, and Blackout. Those three were when Scorpions were at their peak. Anyway, this is Scorpions Start That, 1979. The Clash puts out London Calling. Big deal. Pink Floyd puts out The Wall. 1979, what else? What's coming out now? Hemispheres by Rush. Supertramp puts out Breakfast in America, which was kind of a big deal, obviously. Led Zeppelin, In Through the Outdoor, comes out in 1979. Movies, The Kids Are All Right and Quadrophenia come out this year. 1979, Apocalypse Now. Alien. For some reason, 1979 just sounded wrong to me, but it was 1979. Mad Max was released in Australia in 79. And The Jerk, remember that? Steve Martin? That was kind of his real movie breakthrough. That came out in 1979. And then also Meatballs. Do you remember that movie, Meatballs? Bill Murray? 1979, that's when that came out. And a couple other real significant things that happened in 1979. Again, when they're putting out, there's Van Halen 2. John Wayne dies. I remember that. That was a pretty big deal. And then that was when the hostages were taken in Iran. That was in November 4th of 1979. That's the year that happened. Van Halen 2. Okay. Van Halen 2 is recorded in just 6 days, 1/3 the time required for the first LP. Quote, "Our idea is to keep it as simplistic, as innocent, as unassuming, and as stupid as possible," unquote, explains Roth, not exactly endearing the group to critics. "Rock and roll it isn't," asserts Robert Palmer of the New York Times, prompting Roth to counter with his now famous remark, "Rock critics like Elvis Costello because he looks like most of them." It was a great line, and classic David Lee Roth. On April 8th, Van Halen commenced their Second World Tour, which is notable for its longevity, 10 months. Its 22-ton, 10,000-watt sound system, and its 10 tons and 44,000 watts of light. Besides propelling Van Halen into the ranks of superstardom, turning the page, the 1979 tour indulges their fondness for the niceties of road life. Groupies come and go from hotel rooms like commuters, something Roth hardly tries to cover up. "This is Never Neverland," he sighs happily. "It's like being Hugh Hefner." Okay. 1980. So what was going on in 1980? 1980 was a big deal for music because Back in Black came out, AC/DC. Of course, Bon Scott had died. And Back in Black, in my estimation, is the greatest rock album ever recorded. There might be some that are as good, maybe, but I don't think there's anything better anywhere. That thing, that was such a significant thing, 1980s when that came out, which is amazing to think about how long ago that was now. That's crazy to think. That's, what is that, 45 years old, Back in Black. Whew. Ozzy Osbourne puts out Blizzard of Oz. Iron Maiden puts out debut album, Iron Maiden. Judas Priest puts out British Steel, which was, for a lot of people, Judas Priest's top biggest thing, the most important thing they did. It's not my favorite one, but for a lot of people, that is the thing. Motorhead puts out Ace of Spades, which really was their kind of signature thing. Scorpions put out Animal Magnetism, which is kind of the second one in that little trifecta I was talking about. The Police put out Zenyatta Mondatta, which was a huge deal. U2 puts out Boy. This is when U2's introduced to the world, 1980. This is when Van Halen's putting out Women and Children First. Let's see, and Permanent Waves by Rush. We just put out a video on Permanent Waves, I don't know, a week and a half ago or so, and we've had, so many people love that album. I think we've had at this point something like 60 some odd thousand views on that video that we put out. I mean, so many comments, so many people love that album. But that was the year. That's what was going on when Van Halen's putting out Women and Children First, Rush is putting out Permanent Waves. John Lennon and Yoko Ono put out Double Fantasy. Billy Joel puts out Glass Houses. Oh my gosh, I remember Glass Houses. You may be right, I may be crazy, but I just may be a lunatic. You're looking. Oh my gosh, I had that cassette tape. I bought that cassette tape. I remember when I first heard that song and I just had to have that cassette. So maybe my parents bought it for me or something. I loved that song so much. And I had this little radio that I would play it in, and I listened to that over and over and over and over. I loved that thing. Glass Houses was so significant for me. Okay, also in 1980, the Blues Brothers. Do you remember that? The Blues Brothers. 1980 when that came out. Cruising. I never actually saw the movie, but I had the soundtrack, and it was a crazy cool soundtrack for Cruising. Empire Strikes Back came out. The Shining, which gave me a lot of sleepless nights in my young life. Friday the 13th. One of the funniest movies ever made, Airplane, came out in 1980. Flash Gordon, which was important from a music standpoint because who did the music in that album, in that movie? Queen did. Flash, he saved every one of us. Remember that? That's so funny. I was so excited to see it. I remember we saw it in the theater and there's this part of me that goes, yeah, Queen, I think they're supposed to be, they're really awesome, you know, and because you'd hear things. And so you're so excited to see it because of Queen. Anyway. And then the other one that was a big movie that came out, which I still remember when that came out, was 9 to 5. Dolly Parton, remember that one? And then also 1980, John Lennon dies, John Bonham dies, and Bon Scott. I mean, talk about three heavyweights in pop culture and music. I mean, these guys had such an impact on the world. And then the other thing that happened, again, in context, that was the year Mount St. Helens, when it erupted. Do you remember that? I remember hearing about all the crazy stuff that was happening. I'm just a kid. And this is all happening when Women and Children First is coming out. Okay, 1980. The 9-month 1980 Invasion tour begins in March. Once again, it's the Technophile's dream, employing a Van Halenized PA previously used by the Bee Gees. The 700,000 watts of light, Roth claims, sets a Guinness World Record. Their third LP, Women and Children First, was recorded economically in 2.5 weeks and comes with a fold-out poster of Roth chained to a fence, the work of famed fashion photographer Helmut Newton. By the way, I don't know if I have that poster anywhere. I used to have it. When I bought that album, I remember pulling that out going, huh? What is this? I mean, you knew who it was, and you go, but why do I have a poster of David Lee Roth chained to a fence? You know, his hands are up over his head on this. You can look it up if you've never seen it before. And David Lee Roth actually wanted all the guys in the band to do it too. But I think it might have been Alex. He talks about this in his book. He's like, no, we're the people who are unchained, although they hadn't put that out yet. But that was kind of his attitude. Like, we don't do that. But somehow David Lee Roth still managed to get this picture of himself chained to a chain link fence for whatever reason. And I'll admit, it's an iconic image, but I just didn't understand it. But David Lee Roth will be David Lee Roth. What do you say? Okay. It's a troublesome year for Roth. In March, he fractures his hand during a fight with a disco fan in the Starwoods parking lot. The fan, Roth discloses afterwards, quote, brought my sexual preferences into the conversation, unquote. In April, Roth is charged with inciting a crowd to, quote, light up during a show in Cincinnati, violating an Ohio law. He is freed on $5,000 bail. 3 months later, the charges are dismissed. Roth breaks his nose in late May after the band finishes a song for Italian TV. He executes one of his patented leaps on the darkened stage and smashes into the lighting rig. He jets back to the U.S. for medical attention. Quote, the doctor with my nose a little bit and said that I should relax a few weeks, Roth said, adding with a chuckle, I caught the next flight to Europe and we played, unquote. Through it all, he remains eminently quotable as evidenced by this pearl about rock stars. Quote, I don't have too many musician friends because most of them are just high-grade neurotics with sex problems, unquote. Van Halen act like typical excessive rock stars on at least one occasion. Prior to a concert at the University of Southern California, the band spots brown M&Ms in a candy dish going against a rider in its contract and proceeds to demolish a dining room, a bathroom, and a dressing room. Total cost of damages, $10,000. This brown M&M thing, I'm sure a lot of people here already know this, but there are always people that don't. So I'm just going to real quick explain that, especially because my mother, who's the only person I know who watches every single video, will not know what this means. So I'm going to explain it real quickly. When you hear all the things that Van Halen had, these excessive, massive lighting rigs, massive sound systems that all had these very important power consumption and requirements just for power. What they did is inside the contract for whenever they would show up to a place to play, they had a contract that said, here's all the things that we need. And in the middle of that contract, there was this one little thing that would say, we need a bowl of brown M&Ms, or we need a bowl of M&Ms with all the brown M&Ms removed. And so when they would show up to a show, it wasn't because they were just trying to be obnoxious egomaniacs, and so we just want all the brown M&Ms. It wasn't that. They would go to a show, and they'd go in the dressing room, and if they didn't find a bowl of brown M&M or of M&Ms with the brown M&Ms removed, they knew that the people hadn't read the contract. And they knew that there was going to be potential problems with their equipment, with the power that they needed, and all this stuff. And so then they knew that there was potential problems if there wasn't a bowl of M&Ms with the brown ones removed. And that was it. It was a very simple thing, and it was kind of brilliant when you think about it. But it goes parallel with all the things we're reading here, because as they're explaining all these massive things that they were taking on the road that required all these different, these really important specs just for safety. If they'd show up and these people, it's like, you guys have not read the contract clearly, because they had that thing right in the middle. So when so many people look at it and think of it, it's some sort of rock star egocentrism and excess. It's not that at all. It was a very practical thing to make sure that the people at the place that they showed up had actually read the contract. Anyway, kind of pretty interesting and important context. Okay, 1981, on April 11th, Eddie marries actress Valerie Bertinelli. Valerie Bertinelli, do you remember that? I remember, I don't know why I remember that, because it was One Day at a Time that show was on. It was really popular, and everybody knew who Valerie Bertinelli was, and all of a sudden you're like, what? How would two people, a rock star and a TV star, even know each other? You know, of course, dumb kid brain. You don't think of and then you're like, well, you know, and anyway, so they were married. So the other things that are going on in 1981, this is so fascinating to me. 1981, for those about to rock, AC/DC, which is the follow-up, obviously, to Back in Black, which wasn't as good, but it was still, that song, For Those About to Rock, one of the most epic rock tunes in history. Still one of my favorite songs ever recorded. Iron Maiden puts out Killers, which then really, really becomes a signature thing for Iron Maiden, where a lot of people, including the band, maybe weren't super, super happy with that first album, just the Iron Maiden Killers. Man, that one they nailed it in that one. That was so important. Ozzy Osbourne puts out Diary of a Madman. Def Leppard puts out High and Dry, which is their best album. Rush puts out Moving Pictures. Rolling Stones, Tattoo You. Also Rush puts out Exit Stage Left, which I've talked about a bunch on this channel too, which we'll do a show on that one of these days, because that was such a great album. Let's see here. Rolling Stones put out Tattoo You, which was kind of a big deal. Journey put out Escape, which was a big deal, because, I mean, even today that album still just resonates. The Police put out Ghost in the Machine. Stevie Nicks, Belladonna. That's the year Belladonna comes out. The year that Van Halen puts out Fair Warning, Belladonna comes out. U2 puts out October, which was their second. Billy Squier puts out Don't Say No, which also, one of the greatest rock albums of that era, comes out the same year as Fair Warning. Phil Collins, Face Value. REO Speedwagon, High Infidelity. And then other things happening in 1981. Raiders of the Lost Ark comes out the same year as Fair Warning. Clash of the Titans, you remember that movie? I loved that show, and you go back and watch it today and you go, wow, that was so cheap. That's how they did things back then, you know, the way they did the animation. That was just how they did it. And it's actually, it's so wonderful watching it now, because that old time animation is so cool. Time Bandits, that was the year Time Bandits came out. Chariots of Fire. Dun, 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 dun. I think, anyway, that song still gets played around just because that was such a big deal. 1981, same year as Fair Warning. Stripes. You remember Stripes? That was the year Stripes came out. And then Natalie Wood died that year. And on January 20th of 1981, the same year as Fair Warning, that was when the Hostages that we talked about earlier, this is when they were released this year. All this stuff is what's happening when Fair Warning comes out. Okay, in May, Van Halen released their most adventurous and poorest selling LP, Fair Warning. Once again, the group embarks on a 10-month tour. Doesn't he miss having a home base, Alex has asked. I feel that my home base actually is the stage, he replies. Roth, in order to avoid the types of injuries he suffered in the 80 tour, begins a daily ritual of warm-up exercises and having his legs taped, a program designed by Jack Kern, trainer for the basketball team LA Lakers. By the way, an important note about this, when they start talking about this album coming out, and what did they say? It said that poorest selling. Now, all I can tell you is what Noel Monk said in his book. But one of the things that Noel Monk brings out in his book is that when they put out Fair Warning, it really was not selling well. And they were worried that it was not going to go platinum, and they didn't want that to happen. You know, they'd been successful. Boom, 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 platinum, platinum, platinum. And then all of a sudden they put out this album that's a little bit darker and it just doesn't do as well. And they're like, we can't have an album that doesn't go platinum. We just can't have it. Now, according to Noel Monk in his book, he says that they actually engaged in what is known as payola. Now, I say these things, and a lot of Van Halen people who know all this history start, no, this and that, and they start arguing with me. I'm just telling you that this is something that Noel Monk talked about in his book. And he says that they were worried about it. They didn't think they were going to cross that platinum mark. They knew they needed to, and the only way to get the sales up was to engage in this, which is basically, it was a pay-to-play thing where they would actually pay radio stations to play certain songs to kind of push songs, and help sales go up. Now, I'm just the messenger here, and it's just an interesting thing to contemplate because that album was selling so poorly, but somehow it picked up and it managed to cross that threshold. A program designed by Jack Kern, LA Lakers, Kerry talked about. And in order to protect himself in another area, the singer takes out paternity insurance with Lloyd's of London. Quote, "You've got to cover your behind," is his explanation. Okay, 1982, Van Halen's fifth LP, Diver Down, contains 4 cover tunes. I think that is not exactly correct. I believe the correct answer is 5 cover tunes on that album. And if you want to count them with me, you've got Where Have All the Good Times Gone, which is an old Kinks tune. You've got Pretty Woman, which is a Roy Orbison song. Dancing in the Streets, which was Martha and the Vandrells. It was written originally by Marvin Gaye. I love Marvin Gaye. And then you had Big Bad Bill of Sweet William Now, which is Margaret Young. It says Milton Alger, Jack Yellen. I don't know who the writers were, but that was not their own song. Although that was noteworthy because, of course, Jan Van Halen, Eddie and Alex's father, played the clarinet on that song, but it wasn't their song. And then the other one, which maybe people just kind of ignore, is Happy Trails, which, of course, was not their song. But anyway, so there were 5 cover tunes on that album. So 5 cover tunes. So now, interestingly, let's talk about really quickly what happened in 1982. Because 1982 was, I said 1980 was a big deal. 1982 was a huge deal for music and pop culture. So just go through a couple of these. Because this is what's happening when Diver Down is coming out. Here's what else is happening in the world of music and pop culture. Iron Maiden, Number of the Beast. I mean, come on. One of the greatest heavy metal albums ever. Anyway, Scream for Vengeance also. Come on. That's another great one. Scorpions, they kind of close out that trifecta I talked about with Blackout. Creatures of the Night from Kiss, where they'd kind of like off the radar for most people. Then they put out Creatures of the Night and they remain off the radar. But for a lot of Kiss fans, they go, huh? Hey, wait a minute. That's actually pretty good. So that was a big deal for them. And they still, even at the end of the road for them, they were still playing songs from that album. Had some good stuff on it. The Clash, Combat Rock comes out. Duran Duran's Rio comes out this year. Again, this is when Diver Down's coming down. Look at all this stuff. These are things today we still remember how big they were. The Go-Go's put out Vacation. Rush puts out Signals. And then, of course, what is the other thing that comes out in this year that just changes the world? Michael Jackson, Thriller. Fleetwood Mac puts out Mirage. Asia's debut album comes out this year. And then Led Zeppelin, they put out Coda. The movies that come out this year, Blade Runner, Tron. Remember Tron? Whoa. Dark Crystal. Man, I loved the Dark Crystal. That was a Jim Henson thing. It was kind of, Muppet-ish, but I actually loved it. And it even has a kind of a cult following even today. Creep Show. Remember Creep Show? Did you ever see that one? Had those little 4 different or 6 different vignettes in it. The one creature that's in that box under the stairs always reminded me for some reason of the creature on the cover of Abominog. I don't think they look all that much alike, but for some reason in my head, those are the same thing. Let's see here. So Poltergeist came out. First Blood, 48 Hours. Oh my gosh. Do you remember that? 82. Fast Times at Richmond High, 82. And also in 1982, that's the year that Randy Rhoads died. Same year that Diver Down comes out. Okay, some interpret this as a tip of the hat to their bar band roots. Others contend it's a disturbing indication of diminishing songwriting abilities. The first single is a version of Roy Orbison's "Oh Pretty Woman," which Roth points out has a whole part missing simply because he forgot to learn the lyrics. Now recognized as one of, and that's an interesting thing. I don't want to brush over that too quickly, but I know a lot of people, even on this channel, that's how they see that album. That it was kind of their least favorite thing that Van Halen ever did. We have a whole video on this channel about Diver Down. And to me, it was one of the most important Van Halen albums because it was the one that really introduced me to them, which is a weird one to get introduced to Van Halen on, but I loved it. I didn't even know that the songs on there were cover tunes at first. But I just fell in love with that album. And so that kind of became the Van Halen touchstone for me. And then, you kind of rewind from there and you start discovering all the amazing stuff. But anyway, I always liked Diver Down. Let's see, now recognized as one of the U.S. premier attractions, Van Halen can afford a slight cutback on road work, and the Hide Your Sheep tour is their shortest ever, a mere 5 months. There's no skimping on the technical end. This time, a crew of 70 is needed to keep the show on the road. And this is an actually important point, but because of this, what you have is it leads to band members straying just a little bit. Because as we said a minute ago, with Michael Jackson's Thriller, we talked about Eddie Van Halen playing the solo on that song. That was a no-no in the Van Halen guys, but he'd kind of, I'm just doing a favor for something, not a big deal. And, all of a sudden, Eddie Van Halen is all over the world and one of the biggest songs in history on the biggest album in history. And so that caused a little bit of a crack. In October, Eddie suffers a hairline fracture of his right wrist while horsing around in his hotel room. He's forced to wear a cast for the rest of the tour, which ends in December. Total gross of $10 million. And then we get to 1983. And again, this is 1983 when this magazine comes out, so we don't even know about 84. So this is what's so fascinating about this. In January, the band goes to South America for a 1.5 month long tour. Plans to continue to tour Europe and Far East are scrapped when Van Halen reportedly are pressured into returning home to work on their 6th album, not a live LP as previously rumored, due for release later this year. And that would become the album 1984. But really quickly, as they're going through this, what else was going on in the world? Think about this now. They've been out touring on Diver Down, short tour, et cetera, the fracture and all the other things. And then what is going on in the rest of the world of music? Kill 'Em All, Metallica comes out. Dio's Holy Diver comes out. Iron Maiden's Peace of Mind comes out around this time. Def Leppard's Pyromania comes out at this time. Kiss, Lick It Up, Taking the Makeup Off. Ozzy Osbourne puts out Bark at the Moon. U2 puts out War in 1983, which really for the band U2 was a turning point. Those first 2 albums were okay, But by the time they put War out, it was like they'd found themselves on that album, and it was such a big, that album, that tour was such a big deal. Because of course that tour is what led to the live album Under a Blood Red Sky and the video, which actually was filmed out at Red Rocks in Colorado. So that was a big, big deal. That was a lot of big stuff happening right then. The Police come out with Synchronicity, their biggest thing. Billy Idol comes out with Rebel Yell, which is technically his second album. ZZ Top, Eliminator, and then Yes 90125 comes out at this time. And we did a video on 90125 about a month ago, and that we had so many views on that thing. It's crazy. If you're into Yes, and you need to go watch. A lot of people got mad at me for not putting more emphasis, or actually any emphasis. I may not have even mentioned Bill Bruford in the video, and a lot of people didn't like that. It wasn't intentional. It's just like a lot of these videos, it's train of thought, and if I skip over things, I just skip over them. And then the other things happening in 1983, Star Wars: Return of the Jedi comes out in 83. WarGames. You remember WarGames? Matthew Broderick? Man, I loved that movie. Tic-Tac-Toe at the end. Cujo. And A Christmas Story and Risky Business, all in 1983. Anyway, and then that's the end. That's the end of this article. So it stops right there, right before the good stuff. But of course, this is where, Eddie Van Halen, then he's building that studio in his backyard. And then his relationship with Ted Templeman gets a little bit strained, and then they put together, then they record 1984, which really becomes, at least for the Van Halen brothers, and Alex talks about that in his book, they'd really reached the vision of Van Halen, who Van Halen was, what they were supposed to be, and anyway, I hope you enjoy this stuff. I have so much fun reading through these things and reminiscing about all this crazy, interesting history that was happening back then. And again, if you made it through this whole video, I'd really love to get your feedback. What is this like, kind of putting these things in context? Because to me, part of the enjoyment of these things is understanding the context and looking back at these things while they were happening, what was going on, and how the world was what was going on in the world. Some of this stuff is actually really interesting to think about. All these things were going on around that time that all of us were living through. And we remember these moments, but we don't often kind of put them together. Well, yeah, those two things were happening right at that same time. And all of us, there's so many people on this channel that are kind of around the same age. We were all, wherever we were in the world, we were kind of experiencing those things in our own little corner of the world at the time. And I find it kind of fascinating, kind of looking back and putting these pieces together. And so anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. Love to get your feedback on this video, your thoughts about it, any additional things that were happening at this time that maybe I overlooked, didn't think about, that should have been put on these lists that kind of add context to what was going on at the time. I know there was probably hundreds of things that I left out. I just kind of just came up with a list that I thought kind of worked. And also, please like the video. If you're not following the channel, I'd really love it if you'd follow the channel. And it helps just because that number growing, it's helping us as we are kind of diving into other things and trying to get other people involved with it. Having that large number of followers actually helps. And so we really appreciate it if you just hit that follow button so that number can continue to grow. And we get contacted by a lot of people. How can we help? What can we do to help the channel grow? The biggest thing you can do right now is, if you're a Van Halen fan, you probably know other people that are too. Select the share button and go put it on your Facebook, share it with other people, email it, message it, whatever, because the more people that watch it, obviously, word of mouth is what helps these things, actually, truthfully, is what helps these things grow. We'd really appreciate it if you do that. And anyway, with that, thanks for watching, and have yourself a fantastic day.